All right, our next topic is going to go into plant hormones and responses. Title of your chapter here is Control Systems in Plants. So these are kind of internal clocks or ways that the plant has of responding with the environment, with these systems. So plants have these kind of internal biological clocks, and they control different types of cycles in the plant. So there's rhythms that are kind of fine-tuned by environmental cues. Um, a lot of times plants will be on cues with day and night, and so they will say bloom in the day, or they will rise up or stand up during the day and lay down at night. Now sometimes that's a response to sunlight, and so that would be one way the plant can respond. Other times it's just an internal biological clock or rhythm that the plant has. So we mentioned in the outline a few examples like the shedding of leaves when the plants, when trees shed their leaves to go through winter. That's a survival mechanism, so the plant doesn't continue to lose water all winter long. The stomates, we talked about the stomates in the last podcast, and the opening and closing of these. It was once thought that they opened and closed just due to sunlight shining on them, but then through studies of putting them in the dark during the day and still evaluating the stomates, they open and close on a rhythm, and it's in a 24-hour pattern, but not really triggered by the sun. So there's a lot of different types of mechanisms that plants have inside, and hormones are key for triggering these responses. Just like we have an endocrine system with series of hormones that we use to help regulate growth, metabolism, things like that. Plants also have hormones, not a series of systems and glands, but they do have hormones that help these processes. Here's a common response plants have to light. So plants bloom, and that's a response. Growing, blooming, those are all responses that plants have. So some plants bloom when the conditions are right for the amount of light they receive. So in this case right here, this plant right here blooms when it has a short day. So the yellow part of the bar is representing daylight, the gray part is representing night. The dotted line represents the half of the day. All right. So when the plant is exposed to a longer period in a 24-hour period of light than dark, it doesn't bloom. When it's exposed to a short period of light and a long period of dark, it blooms. We call this plant a short day or long night plant. All right. This is a very sensitive mechanism that the plant has. It's so sensitive that if you put a little flash of light in that long period of darkness right there, just a quick burst flash, the plant will not bloom. It will receive that as being more like this, with a longer period followed by a shorter period. All right. So the opposite, if these are the same three conditions, and these plants bloom on the opposite. So we call those long day, longer sunlight, short darkness, or short night. All right. So that's a type of response of flowering due to the amount of light. We call that a photoperiod. So photo periodism is response a plant has to the duration of light and time. These internal clocks that plants have are sometimes called circadian rhythms. We mentioned that term in the outline. Should mention that. Okay, so that's a response, the flowering. Another response that plants have is growth. So a plant can grow in response to certain conditions, and we call that trophisms. So trophism is a growth response, and there's different types of trophisms. We mentioned three different types of tropisms in our outline. The first one is response to light. So, and we call that phototropism. So phototropism is basically the bending of the plant moving toward the light. And again, there's hormones responsible in here, and we'll talk about those in a bit. But this, for instance, if you put this in the windowsill, the plant grow toward the window. If you flip it around the other way, it'll reorient itself and grow back the other way. That's growing toward the light. That's called phototropism, and we can even track the cells in there to see the cellular mechanism underlying that. All right. The next one in that line we mentioned is gravitropisms. All right. So plants grow up, roots grow down, and we may say, well, they're growing up because the sun's up there and they're responding to the sun, and that is true. But when we look at roots, they're not growing in response to the sunlight. It's not phototropism, but the roots still, even if you place the seed in there sideways, like this example right here, this seed's placed in right, the shoot system starts going up, the root down, but this one's placed in there sideways, and the root starts coming out sideways, but your tree's not going to grow in the ground sideways. Eventually, the shoot will orient itself up. This does that right off the bat, even before it gets out of the seed, and the root will eventually orient itself down. And so that is gravity that the plant is responding to. That we call gravitropism. The third example of tropism we mentioned is thigmotropism, and this is response to a solid object. So here's the tendrils we looked at before, modifications in the plant. So the tendril will grab and go around this object right here. When it hits that solid object, it starts growing around it. Sometimes a tree will run into an object, it'll start growing over this way. Vines do this a lot. So that's response to a solid object or to touch. And so that's a third example of tropism. So those are three different types of tropisms, growth responses. Okay, another type of response, well, yeah, we're going to look at that in a minute, but let's look at the hormone themselves. All right, so all these responses that plants have are triggered by surges of hormones that the plant has, just like we have hormones involved in our process, plants do too. And they're the same type thing. They're chemical signals that are made in one part of the plant body, and then they are transported to another where they trigger a response in that target cell. So very similar action as ours. Now they don't have as many hormones as we have. We have a lot of different hormones in all the different glands we have. Plants only have 5 major classes of hormones. So there's a lot of specific chemicals under these 5 classes, but really the 5 classes are here. We list each 5 classes out. You do need to know these. And we list a little bit about what these are involved in the plant. And a lot of agricultural practices these days is using these things, manufacturing these types of hormone chemicals outside of the plant, and then using them on the plant for certain things. So that's why we can get larger fruit and more and that kind of thing from these hormones. All right, so the first one is auxins. We mentioned the first one is auxins. They're involved in a number of different things. We list in that line. Cell elongation, phototropism, we mentioned that, gravitropism, apical dominance. Apical dominance is when the apical meristems are dominant over the lateral meristems. All right, so we talked about that in our first podcast here. So this means the plant's going to be more primary growth and grow taller than it does wider. All right, we also mentioned that it's involved in fruit development, the development of fruits. Second one in the outline is gibberellins here. Gibberellins are involved in cell division. They delay senescence. That's a botanical word for aging, the aging of the plant. And then it's also involved in flowering and seed germination and hybrid vigor. That's the ability of a hybrid to be viable, is dependent on that hormone being present. Cytokinins is the next one we mentioned there, and it's involved in cell division. And it interacts with auxins in apical dominance. Just like we have hormones that interact with each other for certain processes, plants also do. Ethylene involves ripening of fruit, leaf abscission, the falling off of leaves in the winter, and then senescence. And then the last one, abscisic acid, ABA, sometimes abbreviated. ABA is involved in the stomatal closure. That's the opening and closing of the stomates. And also in seed dormancy, the ability of a seed to remain dormant for long periods of time is dependent upon that hormone being present. All right, so your book shows some examples of all of those. And again, here's an example that the hormones are involved in, are involved in agricultural uses to delay fruit dropping. So they time the release or spray the plant with hormones to help get the fruit to drop when they want it to. And that's where we end our podcast on plant hormones and responses. And that ends the podcast on plants for this unit.